My name is Alina. I'm 58 years old, and 18 months ago I sat at a long pine table in a lake house in the Laurentians, eating the best dessert I'd had in years, while the family who made it sat 3 feet away from me, in French, taking it apart. They didn't know I could understand every word. My last name is Whitcomb. I have pale eyes and a quiet voice, and I spent the last 20 years of my career being underestimated by people who assumed that, because I worked for the English-speaking side of a bilingual government department. French was something I'd studied in school and mostly forgotten. People made that assumption about me for almost 3 decades, in boardrooms in Brussels and Geneva and Paris, and for almost 3 decades, I let them. That night at that table, the people making the assumption were my future daughter-in-law's parents. And what they said, calmly, warmly, passing dishes back and forth while they said it, was that their daughter had never finished anything in her life, that her little cafe was an embarrassment they'd quietly been subsidizing for years, and that the only useful thing this marriage was going to do was finally give her something to occupy her time. I sat there with a fork in my hand and a piece of the most extraordinary sugar pie I had ever tasted on my plate, made by the woman they were describing, and I smiled, and I said in English that everything was delicious. And then I started planning. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where we tell quiet stories about the moments people reveal exactly what they think, certain no one in the room can understand them. If you've ever sat at a table and heard someone's real opinion of a person they claim to love, this one is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Hit subscribe so the next one finds you. Let me take you back to the beginning, to who I was before that dinner, and who Camille was to the family that raised her, because you need both halves of this to understand what happened in the 18 months after. I spent 28 years working for the Canadian government, most of it as a trade commissioner, posted abroad for long stretches, first in Paris, then Geneva, then Brussels. My mother was a Franco-Ontarian from a small town near Sudbury, and I grew up speaking French at her kitchen table and English everywhere else, the ordinary bilingual childhood of a lot of people in that part of the country. By the time I started my career, my French was good enough that I could work in it, and over the years it became one of those things I rarely advertised, because in my line of work, being underestimated was useful. People speak more freely around someone they think can't follow them. I learned more in my career from conversations I wasn't supposed to understand than from any meeting I was actually invited to. It's not a skill you can really turn off, once you have it. You just keep listening, quietly, long after most people would have stopped. I retired 5 years ago. My husband, Paul, and I settled into a slower life, the kind with a garden and grandchildren on the horizon, and our younger son, Liam, started dating a woman named Camille about 2 years after that. Camille ran a small cafe in the city, the kind of place with 6 tables and a case of pastries she made herself, every one of them every morning before the doors opened. Liam met her there, the way these things happen, ordering coffee on a Tuesday and then finding reasons to order coffee on a lot of other days after that. I liked Camille immediately. She was warm in a specific, slightly apologetic way, the warmth of someone who's used to taking up less space than she actually needs. She asked thoughtful questions. She remembered small things people told her, and she was, unmistakably, enormously talented in a way she seemed almost embarrassed by. The first time she brought us a box of pastries, an apology for being late to dinner, I understood within one bite that what she did for a living was not a hobby. It was the kind of work that takes either a lifetime of training or a genuine gift, and in Camille's case, I suspected both. I asked her about her family early on, the way you do, gently, getting to know someone. And I noticed, the way I'd learned to notice things over a career of paying attention to what people didn't say, that Camille's answers about her family were careful. Practiced. The answers of someone who'd given a version of this explanation many times and had smoothed the edges off it. Her family was from Quebec, originally, a town outside Montreal, though they'd long since relocated to a large lake house in the Laurentians that functioned as the family's gathering place. Her parents, Sylvie and Mark, were both retired professionals, the kind of retired that comes with significant money. Her older sister, Vivienne, was a cardiologist. Her older brother, Etienne, ran a successful logistics company. And Camille, the youngest by several years, ran a cafe. They're proud of you, I said once, the way you say things you hope are true and are gently checking. Camille smiled, and it was a real smile, but it had something underneath it. They're proud of Vivienne and Etienne, she said. With me, I think they're still waiting to see what I turn into. I filed that away. I didn't know yet how much it would matter. Liam proposed about a year later, in the cafe, after hours, with the lights still on over the pastry case, which I thought was exactly right for both of them. Camille said yes, and a few months after that, her parents invited the whole family, our whole family, to the lake house for a weekend, to get to know each other properly before the wedding. Camille was nervous about that weekend in a way I noticed and didn't fully understand yet. She mentioned, more than once, in the casual tone people use when they're trying to lower expectations in advance, that her family could be a lot, that they had strong opinions, that we shouldn't take anything too personally. I told her we'd be fine. I'd spent decades in rooms with people who had strong opinions. I wasn't worried about myself. I was worried. I realized only later about the wrong person. If you're watching this and you've ever noticed someone you care about quietly lowering the room's expectations before you even walk in, you already know the specific tenderness of that warning and the specific dread underneath it. Stay with me. The dinner is coming. Hit subscribe so the next one finds you. The lake house was beautiful, the way these places always are, all cedar and big windows and a dock that ran out into water so still it looked like glass. Sylvie and Mark were gracious hosts, in the practiced way of people who have hosted a great many weekends like this one. Vivienne and her husband arrived with their 2 children, who were polite and well-dressed in the way children are when they've been told, more than once, how to behave at the lake house. Etienne arrived alone, his wife couldn't get away, and spent a fair amount of the weekend on his phone. Camille arrived with 2 large coolers because she had insisted on making dinner for everyone the first night, a gesture I recognized immediately as both generous and underneath it a kind of offering. A way of contributing something, of being useful in the specific currency her family seemed to value. She made an entire dinner, mostly from scratch, including, for dessert, a sugar pie. Tarte au sucre, the traditional Quebec kind, made with her grandmother's recipe, the kind of dessert that takes real technique to get right, the filling set perfectly, not too sweet, with a pastry so good I actually put my fork down for a moment after the first bite, the way you do when something is genuinely better than you expected. I want to tell you about that pie because it matters later. Dinner went well on the surface. Everyone was polite. Paul and Mark found common ground discussing fishing, the way men of a certain generation always seem to. Sylvie asked me about my career, and I gave her the short version, the trade commissioner version, without elaborating on the languages, because it had simply never come up and there was no reason for it to. After the meal, while the table was being cleared, the conversation shifted. Vivienne's children had been put to bed. Liam and Camille had gone down to the dock with Etienne to look at the stars, the kind of thing young people do to escape a table full of older relatives. Paul had gone to help Mark with something in the garage, which left me at the table with Sylvie, Mark, and Vivienne clearing the last of the dishes. And it was then comfortable, relaxed, among people they assumed shared a language only with each other, that Sylvie said to Vivienne, scraping a plate, "Tu es gâté la tarte." Elle bien réussi, G. Dois Dyer. You tried the pie? She did it well, I have to say. Vivienne said something agreeing and then added lightly, "C'est dommage qu'elle n'y met pas autant d'effort dans des choses qui content." It's a shame she doesn't put that much effort into things that matter. I kept my expression exactly where it was. I had a great deal of practice at this. Sylvie sighed, the specific sigh of a parent settling into a familiar topic. On a tellement investi dans ce café, she said. We've invested so much in that cafe. Tout te souviens combien, presque 60 000, et elle n'a jamais pu nous rembourser un sou. You remember how much, almost 60,000, and she's never been able to pay us back a cent. Au moins maintenant, Mark said, not unkindly in the tone of a man offering a silver lining. Avec ce marriage, elle aura quelque chose de stable. Le café, si n'est pas un vrai métier. C'est mignon, mais si n'est pas un vrai métier. At least now, with this marriage, she'll have something stable. The cafe isn't a real job. It's cute, but it's not a real job. Vivienne laughed, not cruelly exactly, the laugh of someone agreeing with an obvious point. Elle n'a jamais fini quoi que ce soit dans sa vie, she said. She's never finished anything in her life. L'université, le programme de pâtisserie en France, le premier emplacement du café avant celui-ci. On vers combien de temps ça va durer, see marriage. University, the pastry program in France, the first cafe location before this one. We'll see how long this marriage lasts. I want to be very precise about what I felt in that moment because it wasn't primarily anger. It was something quieter and more specific, the feeling of watching a pattern complete itself. Camille's careful answers about her family, the apologetic warmth. The way she'd lowered our expectations before we even arrived, as if she were the one who needed to apologize for them in advance. $60,000. Held over her, for years, the way some families hold things, not as a debt with a repayment schedule, but as a permanent, unspoken leverage. A reason to keep doubting her. A reason she'd have to keep proving herself indefinitely to people who had already decided, a long time ago, what she was. Elle a fait un bon dessert aux moins, Sylvie said, finishing the thought almost generously. She made a good dessert, at least. I picked up the last plate from the table, the one with a few crumbs of that extraordinary pie still on it, and I carried it to the kitchen, and I said in English with what I hope was a perfectly normal voice, that I was going to step outside for some air. I stood on the dock for a long time. I watched Liam and Camille and Etienne, three small shapes against the dark water, and I watched Camille laugh at something her brother said, easily, comfortably, the way you laugh with someone when you don't know what they think of you, or maybe when you do know, and have decided it's simply the cost of being in the family at all. I thought about every conversation I'd had with Camille over the past 2 years. Her careful, practiced answers. The way she described her cafe, almost apologetically, as just a little place. The way she'd once mentioned, in passing, that she'd had to close her first location, years ago, for a bunch of boring reasons, and change the subject before I could ask what they were. I thought about the $60,000 and what it must be like to carry that number around for years, not as a debt you're working to repay, but as a story other people tell about you in a language they think you can't understand. And I thought, standing on that dock, about the specific advantage I had, which nobody at that table knew I had, and what I might do with it. If you're watching this and you've ever discovered, by accident, exactly how a family really talks about someone they love, you know the particular stillness that follows. Comment below and tell me what you did with what you learned. Then stay with me, because the next 18 months are the part of this story that actually matters. Hit subscribe so the next one finds you. I didn't say anything that weekend. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strategy, not at first. It was that I understood immediately that saying something, revealing what I'd heard in that moment, would have done exactly one thing. It would have made Camille's family defensive, and it would have made the entire weekend, and likely the entire engagement about that moment, rather than about Camille. I have spent a career in rooms where the worst thing you can do, when you learn something important, is react to it immediately. You wait. You think about what the information is actually for. What I knew by the end of that weekend was this. Camille's family had decided, years ago, that her work wasn't real, and they had attached a number to that decision, $60,000, that functioned less as a loan and more as a verdict, renewed every time it went unmentioned and unrepaid. Camille, for her part, seemed to have absorbed the verdict so completely that she'd started speaking about her own talent in the same diminished terms her family used. What I also knew, because I had eaten the pie, was that the verdict was wrong. I went home from that weekend, and I did something I hadn't done in years, which was open my old contact list. 28 years in trade and economic development leaves you with an enormous number of people you've helped, in small ways, over a long career. People who remember favors the way careful people do, as things to be returned. One of those people was a woman named Bridget, who I'd worked with on a trade delegation to France 15 years earlier, and who now ran the specialty foods division for one of the country's largest grocery chains. Another was a man named Henry, a food writer I'd met at a reception in Brussels, who'd since become one of the most respected culinary journalists in the country, the kind whose name on an article meant something. I didn't tell either of them anything about Camille's family, or the $60,000, or the dinner. I told them about the pie. I told them, honestly, that I'd had a piece of sugar pie at a small cafe run by a young pastry chef that was, without exaggeration, the best version of that dessert I'd had in my life, traditional technique. but with something distinctive about the filling I couldn't quite place. I gave them the cafe's name and address, and I said simply that I thought it was worth a visit if they happened to be in the area. That's all I did. I want to be clear about that, because what happened next wasn't engineered by me, not in the sense of pulling strings or calling in favors that bent any rules. I opened a door. Camille walked through it on the strength of her own work, the way she always could have, if anyone with the right kind of attention had ever bothered to look. Henry visited the cafe about 3 weeks later. He didn't mention me, and Camille, by her own account later, had no idea who he was when he sat down, ordered a coffee and a slice of the sugar pie, and stayed for an hour, asking quiet, specific questions about her training, her ingredients, where the recipe came from. The article ran 6 weeks after that. It was a feature, not a mention, in one of the country's major food publications, about a small cafe pastry chef whose grandmother's sugar pie recipe, Henry wrote, represented the kind of quiet mastery that doesn't announce itself and is all the better for it. He wrote about her training in France, the program her sister had described, 18 months later in that warm kitchen, as something Camille had never finished. Henry's article made clear that Camille had, in fact, completed the program, near the top of her cohort, before a family obligation had brought her home earlier than planned. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Vivienne had described, casually, over dishes, a version of Camille's history that was simply factually not true, not exaggerated, not unkind framing of a true thing. Untrue. And it had been repeated for so long within that family that I suspect even Vivienne believed it. Bridget visited not long after the article ran. She didn't need an introduction by then. Half the city seemed to have read it. She came with someone from her sourcing team, tried 4 of Camille's pastries, and asked, directly, whether Camille had ever considered a wholesale arrangement, supplying a small selection of items to a handful of their flagship locations. Camille called Liam from the cafe that day, and Liam called us, and I listened to my son tell me, with the specific breathless quality of someone relaying news they can barely believe, that Camille's sugar pie was going to be sold in 12 grocery stores across the province. I said it was wonderful. I meant it completely. And I said nothing about Henry or Bridget or a doc or a dinner, because that part wasn't mine to bring up yet. That part was for the wedding. Here is how it actually settled, because I know you want to know. The wedding was 8 months after that cottage weekend, by which point Camille's small cafe had a line out the door most mornings, a wholesale contract with one of the country's largest grocery chains, and a second feature, this one in a glossy magazine that did a full spread on the sugar pie taking over the province, with Camille's photograph on the cover of the food section, standing in her 6-stable cafe, looking, for the first time since I'd met her, like someone who knew exactly what she was. The reception was at the lake house. Sylvie and Mark had insisted, generously, that it was the obvious venue, and Camille, I think, had agreed partly because she was happy, and happiness has a way of making old wounds feel smaller, at least for a while. I gave a toast. Mothers of the groom aren't always expected to, but Liam had asked me to, and Camille had said, warmly, that she'd love it, and I had said yes, and I had spent some time thinking about what I wanted to say. I talked about Liam, first, the way you're supposed to, a few stories, the appropriate amount of gentle embarrassment. And then I talked about the first time I'd had Camille's sugar pie, at a dinner at this very house, 18 months earlier, and how I'd known, after one bite, that I was tasting something rare. I said that talent like that doesn't always get recognized right away. Sometimes, I said, it takes the right person noticing, at the right moment, for everyone else to see what was there all along. And then I looked at Sylvie, and I said in French, clearly in the specific calm voice I'd used in boardrooms for 30 years, a voice that doesn't need to be raised to be heard. Vous m'avez dit, ce soir-là, quasi n'était pas un vrai métier. You told me that night that it wasn't a real career. The room didn't understand, not all of it, the English-speaking half looking around for translation the way rooms do. But Sylvie understood. Mark understood. Vivienne across the table went very still, the specific stillness of someone realizing, 18 months too late, exactly what language had been spoken in that kitchen, and exactly who had been standing on the dock close enough to hear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Je voulais simplement vous dire, I continued, still in French, still calm, que j'ai entendu, et que j'avais raison de ne pas errer d'accord. I just wanted to tell you I heard, and I was right not to agree. Then I switched back to English, raised my glass, and said that I couldn't think of anyone more deserving of everything that was happening to her, and that I was so glad to be part of her family now. And the room, the part of it that hadn't understood a word of French, applauded warmly, and the part of it that had understood every word sat very, very quietly. I sat down. Camille, beside me, squeezed my hand once, hard, and didn't say anything, and I understood from the way she held it. That she'd understood the French too, all of it, and had simply never told anyone, the way you don't tell people things you've made peace with by yourself, alone, for years. Sylvie came to find me later that evening, near the dock, the same dock. She didn't apologize, not exactly, not in words that used that term. But she told me that she and Mark had been thinking, recently, about the $60,000, and that they'd decided, given everything, that the loan should simply be considered settled. Forgiven, done, I told her I thought that was a good decision. You speak French, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Do, I said. I have for a long time. She looked at me for a moment, and there was something in her face that wasn't quite shame, but was adjacent to it, the look of someone recalculating, the way Patricia did in another story I once heard about, the look of a person discovering that a room they thought was private had never been private at all. That night, she said. At dinner. That night, I agreed. She didn't ask what I'd heard. I think she already knew, and I think, more than that, she'd had 18 months to watch what her daughter had built in the space where her family's verdict used to sit, and she'd drawn her own conclusions about which version of Camille had been the true one all along. Camille's cafe now has a second location. The sugar pie is sold in over 30 stores across 2 provinces. Henry has written about her twice more since the wedding. She still works behind the counter most mornings because she likes it, not because she has to, and when people ask her about her training, she tells them the whole story now, the program in France, finished near the top of her class, the way it actually happened. She and her family are better than they were. Not perfect. Sylvie still has opinions, the way Sylvie will always have opinions. But the number is gone. The $60,000 that was never really about money. And something underneath the family's whole dynamic shifted when it disappeared. The way a structure shifts when you remove the load it was quietly built around. If I leave you with one thing, let it be this. People will often tell you who someone is in the language they think that person can't understand, or in the rooms they think that person will never enter. Pay attention to those moments. Not for revenge, though I understand the appeal. Pay attention because they tell you, more honestly than almost anything else will, exactly what someone has been carrying quietly for years, without ever once being believed. And if you ever find yourself holding information like that about someone you love, don't spend it on the people who said it. Spend it on the person they said it about. That's my story. A dock. A pie. A language nobody knew I spoke. And 18 months later, a toast that finally said, out loud, what should have been true the entire time. If this reminded you that someone in your life might be carrying a verdict that was never true to begin with, take that with you today. Share this with someone who's ever been told their work, their passion, or their effort wasn't a real career. Drop a comment below and tell me what languages, literal or otherwise, the people in your life don't know you understand. Hit subscribe. And I will see you in the next one.